so I can't.
Yeah, that's
I can't afford more days off. I have to write.
All right, let's get started. All right, so as I mentioned, next week we're going to do the balance of the readings under the heading Life and History that are scheduled for next week, and those will be the Arcades Project kind of conspectus, the Paris capital of the 19th century, and Paris the capital of the 19th century. We've also got Adorno's letter to Benjamin on the 1935 version, and then we'll see how he incorporates, how Benjamin incorporates revisions in the 1939 version. I think that we looked at the 1939 version briefly. We looked at the intro and the conclusion to that with the phantasmagoria term. I think we made reference to that already. So that's what we'll talk about next week. This week, however, therefore, we're kind of heavy on the readings. And I'm not sure whether we looked at, we might have already looked at the Fusées, the rockets. The world is drawing to an end. Did we not?
No.
Did we not? No? Okay.
I think we did like very early, like months ago.
A little while ago?
But not like
Yeah.
All right, well, we can set the tone with these two short pieces by Baudelaire and Brecht for the just the setting, and then we'll turn to the Nietzsche. So here's Baudelaire. This is towards the end of his life. And so it's unpublished, posthumously published aphorisms. I think that we looked at the Paris spleen aphorisms, like the artist's confession and the stranger, and we looked at a few of those. Did we look at Beat Up the Poor? I don't know if we ever. Oh, we did look at Beat Up the Poor. Okay, good. All right. So here's Baudelaire, and this would be the Baudelaire that proved to be influential for Nietzsche. So Baudelaire is influential for Nietzsche in a variety of ways, but especially his kind of more, what we would now consider to be existentialist kind of considerations on the 19th century, the critique of the 19th century. And we know, of course, that Benjamin was a Nietzschean before he was a Marxist. And so the fact that there's this lineage with Baudelaire and Nietzsche and Benjamin coming back around to Marx is important. So here's from 1867. The world is drawing to an end. Only for one reason can it last longer, just because it happens to exist. Suppose it should continue materially, would that be an existence worthy of its name in the historical dictionary? I do not say that the world will be reduced to expedience in the buffoonish disorder of the republics of South America, that perhaps even we shall return to a savage state, and that we will go through the grassy ruins of our civilization to seek our grazing ground, rifle in hand? No, because such adventures would still suppose a certain vital energy, echo of first ages. We shall furnish a new example of the inexorability of the spiritual and moral laws, and we shall be their victims. We shall perish by the very thing by which we fancy that we live. Technocracy will Americanize us. Progress will starve our spirituality so far that nothing of the bloodthirsty, sacrilegious, or unnatural dreams of the utopists will be comparable to such positive results. Keep that in mind for the readings next week, because Benjamin will be talking about the utopian socialists in the Paris exposés, and we'll be talking about them in class. Universal ruin will manifest itself not solely or particularly in political institutions or general progress or whatever else might be a proper name for it. It will be seen above all in the baseness of hearts. So of course that's our future, that's us. That is in fact us. So we're going to be talking about, with the conversations with Brecht, kind of a thematic that I think that I mentioned earlier in the semester, but perhaps I didn't. So there's a Friedrich Engels phrase
that's resuscitated by Rosa Luxemburg, who's an important German Marxist in the time before Benjamin. That capitalism represents the crossroads or choice between socialism and barbarism. So it's socialism or barbarism. And of course, capitalism is barbarism, meaning the choice of socialism or barbarism means that so long as socialism is not achieved, it's barbarism. So what is barbarism? Barbarism is a decadent civilization. It's not uncivilized, it's decadent civilization. So savagery is contrasted with barbarism. Savagery is a lack of civilization, a lack of culture. It's a noble savage. So being innocent of civilization, innocent of the problems of civilization. That's why the savage is noble. But the barbarian is not noble. The barbarian is decadent, is degenerate. So that's at least the way the Enlightenment used that terminology. And the reason that they used that terminology is that they thought that European civilization had grown decadent. So Kant, for example, said that historical progress required a political stage to be met that he thought was the task of his time. This is in a piece called Idea for a Universal History from a Cosmopolitan Point of View, where he said that the world needed a global civil society and either a world state or a system of states that guaranteed the rights of that civil society. And so long as this was not achieved, we would be living in barbarism, which he called glittering misery. He said the politicians will be judged by posterity on how well they facilitated or rather blocked and hindered the achievement of the world global civil society and world state or world system of states that guaranteed the rights of civil society. By civil society, of course, is meant bourgeois society. So this is a Hegelian concept also. Civil society means bourgeois society. Before capitalism. All right, so glittering misery, technocracy, starved over spirituality, Americanization. And here's Brecht. To posterity, or to those who come after. Indeed, I live in the Dark Ages. A guileless word is an absurdity. A smooth forehead betokens a hard heart. He who laughs has not yet heard the terrible tidings. Ah, what an age it is, when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it is a silence, kind of silence about injustice. And he who walks calmly across the street, is he not out of reach of his friends in trouble? It is true, I earn my living. Believe me, it is only an accident. Nothing that I do entitles me to eat my fill. By chance I was spared. If my luck leaves me, I am lost. They tell me, eat and drink. Be glad you have it. But how can I eat and drink when my food is snatched from the hungry and my glass of water belongs to the thirsty? And yet I eat and drink. I would gladly be wise. The old books tell us what wisdom is. Avoid the strife of the world. Live out your little time, fearing no one, using no violence, returning good for evil. Not fulfillment of desire, but forgetfulness passes for wisdom. I can do none of this. Indeed, I live in the Dark Ages. I came to the cities in a time of disorder, when hunger ruled. I came among men in a time of uprising, and I revolted with them. So the time passed away, which on earth was given me. I ate my food between massacres. The shadow of murder lay upon my sleep. And when I loved with indifference. I looked upon nature with impatience. So the time passed away, which on earth was given me. In my time, streets led to the quicksand. Speech betrayed me to the slaughterer. There was little I could do, but without me, the rulers would have been more secure. This was my hope. So the time passed away, which on earth was given me. You, who shall emerge from the flood in which we are sinking, think, when you speak of our weaknesses,
also of the dark time that brought them forth. For we went, changing our country more often than our shoes, in the class war, despairing, when there was only injustice and no resistance. For we knew only too well, even the hatred of squalor makes the brow grow stern, even anger against injustice makes the voice grow harsh. Alas, we, who wished to lay the foundations of kindness, could not ourselves be kind. But you, when at last it comes to pass that man can help his fellow man, do not judge us too harshly. I wanted to actually start with another little Nietzsche piece before we get into the Nietzsche. Also from around the same time. And that's on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense. So the cosmic rumination. So this is early Nietzsche. We've got early Nietzsche. There's early Nietzsche, middle Nietzsche, and late Nietzsche. Peter Preuss, the scholar, the philosophy scholar who introduces Nietzsche's On Use and Abuse of History for Life. The Hackett version on the advantage and disadvantage of history for life talks about the early, middle, and late Nietzsche. So the early Nietzsche is more romantic. The middle Nietzsche is trying to reckon with the Enlightenment and science, and then the late Nietzsche tries to kind of synthesize everything. What we read from Benjamin on the eternal return is from the late Nietzsche. So it's late Nietzsche comes up in Beyond Good and Evil and on the genealogy of morals, and also is in the unfinished work, The Will to Power. Nonetheless, the early Nietzsche, as Peter Preuss puts it, only the complete Nietzsche is the complete Nietzsche. So even though Nietzsche criticizes his own earlier work, he still seeks to fulfill his agenda from his earlier work. He just has a better self-understanding of what he was after, what he was doing, rather than really fundamentally altering his concerns. Okay, so on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense, I mentioned Kant. We talked about Kant earlier in the semester, the true, the good, and the beautiful. So for ancient peoples, for traditional civilization, the true, the good, and the beautiful are aspects of the same thing. They're intrinsically related. They're eternal in value. So the beautiful is the appearance of the true and the good. Right, so, of course, what Kant did was, as a modern, realized that not only were these perhaps non-identical, but also they were not eternal, and that means that as values they could change, and also the relation between the three values could change historically, between the true, the good, and the beautiful. So when Nietzsche says, on truth and lie, in an extra-moral sense, he means to separate the question of morality from the question of truth, which again, from an ancient perspective, wouldn't make any sense, but is something that modern people have to deal with. In some remote corner of the universe, poured out and glittering in innumerable solar systems, there once was a star on which clever animals invented knowledge. That was the haughtiest and most mendacious minute of world history, yet only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star grew cold and the clever animals had to die. All right, so whose perspective is this from? Perspective that predates and postdates humanity?
Divine?
Yeah, it's like a God perspective, it's a God's eye perspective. But of course, it's our own perspective that we project onto God's perspective. So we invent this perspective outside of our own existence, and we torture ourselves with this viewpoint on ourselves from outside of our existence. Right, so we can do it with God, we can do it with science fiction, we can do it with philosophy, right? we can do it in a number of ways. All right. One might invent such a fable and still not have illustrated sufficiently how wretched, how shadowy and flighty, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. There have been eternities when it did not exist, and when it is done for again, nothing will have happened. For this intellect has no further mission that would lead beyond human life. It is human, rather, and only its owner and producer gives it such importance, as if the world pivoted around it. But if we could communicate with the mosquito, then we would learn that it floats through the air with the same self-importance, feeling within itself the flying center of the world. There is nothing in nature so despicable or insignificant that it cannot immediately be blown up like a bag by a slight breath of this power of knowledge. And just as every porter wants an admirer, the proudest human being, the philosopher, thinks that he sees the eyes of the universe telescopically focused from all sides on his actions and thoughts. It is strange that this should be the effect of the intellect, for after all, it was given only as an aid to the most unfortunate, most delicate, most evanescent beings in order to hold them for a minute in existence, from which otherwise, without this gift, they would have every reason to flee as quickly as Lessing's sun, that haughtiness which goes with knowledge and feeling, which shrouds the eyes and senses of man in a blinding fog. Therefore, it deceives him about the value of existence by carrying in itself the most flattering evaluation of knowledge itself. Its most universal effect is deception, but even its most particular effects have something of the same character. I'm going to jump ahead here. Only through forgetfulness can man ever achieve the illusion of possessing a truth in the sense just designated. If he does not wish to be satisfied with truth in the form of a tautology, that is, with empty shells, then he will forever buy illusions for truths. What is a word? The image of a nerve stimulus in sounds. But to infer from the nerve stimulus a cause outside us, that is already the result of a false and unjustified application of the principle of reason. The different languages set side by side show that what matters with words is never the truth, never an adequate expression, else there would not be so many languages. The thing in itself, for that is what pure truth without consequences would be, is quite incomprehensible to the creators of language and not at all worth aiming for. One designates only the relations of things to man. And to express them, one calls on the boldest metaphors. A nerve stimulus, first transposed into an image, first metaphor. The image, in turn, imitated by a sound, second metaphor. So we read on the mimetic faculty. Yeah, see the resonances here. Let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts. Every word immediately becomes a concept, inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal. In other words, a lot of unequal cases. Every concept originates through our equating what is unequal. No leaf ever wholly equates another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions. It now gives rise to the idea that in nature there might be something besides the leaves, which would be leaf, some kind of original after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be a correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. We call a person honest. Why did he act so honestly today, we ask? Our answer usually sounds like this: because of his honesty. Honesty, that is to say again, the leaf is the cause of the leaves. After all, we know nothing of the essence-like quality named honesty. We know only numerous individualized and thus unequal actions, which we equate by omitting the unequal, and by then calling them honest actions, In the end, we distill from them an occult quality we can name with honesty. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations, which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins, which have lost their pictures, and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as yet we have only heard of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors. In moral terms, the obligation to lie according to a fixed convention, to lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all. So you can see where a lot of postmodernism comes from. Postmodernism is Nietzschean, anti-Hegelian, anti-Kantian, except ultimately postmodernism all goes back to Kant, because actually there's a lot of Kant here. Right, so Kant's the one who said that metaphysical concepts don't refer to things in themselves or to the world in itself, but rather refer to our relation to the world. So that's why our metaphysics can change historically, because we can change our relations. So we've talked about relations, social relations, relations between people and nature, and of people with themselves. Right, it's cosmology. That's what metaphysics refers to. It refers to our practical relations, first to each other, then to nature, and finally to ourselves. It's Rousseau. It's Rousseau's idea. Why do we have concepts? What do they refer to in a metaphysical sense? So anything that ends with a Y is a metaphysical object, like history or honesty. And any ism, because we're going to be talking about historicism, is a reification of a metaphysical object. In other words, it treats the metaphysical object as if it's not subject to change, not changeable. Yep.
He talks about life in a very Plato language.
Yep.
This idea somewhere there.
The noumenal.
Yeah.
That's right. I mean, for me, I don't know, call me old-fashioned, because I've been in a debate in recent months with someone who calls himself a Platonist. I think there's a difference between Plato and Kant. Mm-hmm. Although it's tricky because one doesn't know whether Plato's ethereal realm of eternal forms is meant in earnest, or whether it's a kind of ironical formulation on Plato's part. In other words, whether it's supposed to make us think about how we think rather than asserting a kind of metaphysical truth. Right? It's always tricky with Plato. Right? Is he actually saying what he's saying, or is he trying to get us to think with what he's saying? If you want to know, there's a character who's a contemporary, kind of a little bit younger, but roughly contemporary of Benjamin, also an acquaintance of Hannah Arendt, also a student of Heidegger, and that's Leo Strauss. If you've heard of Leo Strauss, yeah. Leo Strauss. I don't know whether we invoked Leo Strauss when we talked about physis. Physis? Yeah, very briefly, right? So, because Leo Strauss thinks that this concept of physis is what distinguishes Western civilization from all other traditional civilizations. Because all other traditional civilizations have basically a Tao concept as opposed to a physis concept, right? And that maybe, the quote-unquote West, certainly what became Europeans before classical enlightenment, before Plato and Aristotle, before Socrates, would have also had this kind of Taoist kind of notion.
Why is Nietzsche here anti-Hegelian?
It's a good question, right? We're going to get into it in the Use and Abuse of History for Life. So ostensibly he's anti-Kant, ostensibly he's anti-Hegel, but he retreads a lot of the same concerns. The easiest way of thinking about how Nietzsche is anti-Hegelian is that Nietzsche thinks that Hegel gets rid of the contradiction in contradiction. meaning that Hegel, through the dialectic, kind of gets rid of the contradiction, whereas what's important is the contradiction. It's because Hegel is fundamentally ambiguous on this score. Namely, there are two Hegels that are one Hegel with Hegel, but after Hegel become two Hegels, and that's the right Hegelianism and the left Hegelianism. So the right Hegelianism says the world is as it is because that is the will of reason, and the left Hegelians say the world is as it is because we have to change it and we have to use our reason to change it.
So the right is like this narrative of progress too, right? Like we.
Yes, absolutely. That there's a
like
kind of
mental progress that's leading us to where we're supposed to be because dialectics self themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's right.
Well,
So
the left is like we have to solve the dialectics ourselves.
that's right. Yeah. So the thing is, Hegel is both and neither in a dialectical way. He's both and neither a right Hegelian and a left Hegelian. Certainly, there are certain writings of his that seem to make him more out to be a right Hegelian, and there are other writings that seem to make him out to be more of a left Hegelian. The young Hegel seems to be a left Hegelian. The older Hegel seems to be a right Hegelian. But anyway, it could be that the Hegelian dialectic can't be. I mean, this is the Marxist point. This is actually Marx's point, and also we'll see Benjamin's point, that it's impossible for Hegel's original conception to hold together under capitalism. Meaning in capitalism, the Hegelian system has to disintegrate, has to break apart. That's what Marx thought. Marx and Engels in the 1840s, they were like, oh, why is Hegel's philosophy falling apart? And they were like, could it be capitalism that is causing it to fall apart? And the reason for that is that, as Marx put it, the Hegelian dialectic is a bourgeois metaphysics. He called it the bourgeois metaphysics of labor, and capitalism is the destruction of that metaphysics, which means that Kant and Hegel as philosophies can't really hold together under capitalism. They appear to be both true and untrue at the same time, and that to simply assert their truth would be bourgeois ideology, would be to efface the contradiction in capitalism, would make it seem like we're still living in bourgeois society, still living in bourgeois emancipation, freedom according to the freedom of labor, and that's true, but only half true or partially true, which means that it's not true. So anyway, the idea is that as long as we're in capitalism, we'll be living in the shadow of Kant and Hegel. We won't be able to quite overcome them. As Foucault put it, when we think we're overcoming Hegel, we find him staring back at us, impassive. And all the postmodernists pretty much said, including Foucault, who wrote like an encyclopedia entry on himself, he said, all of Michel Foucault's work was an attempt to transcend Kant, but in the end he had to admit that he was unable to do so. Derrida did something similar, and Deleuze is a little bit different, but I think Deleuze also has a kind of like Kant's the ultimate limit or something. So anyway, so let's see where we're going with this on Nietzsche. So I want to start before getting into the use and abuse. I want to look at Peter Preuss.
But I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking about Benjamin and how hard it is for me to understand him because he's very contradictory to me.
This is why.
On one hand, he's Kantian, right? But on the other hand, through like Aristotle and Bergson, he's like vitalist, and like he doesn't think of things in like the ideal realm, but like here, which is how he talks about it, like on the language of man, right? Like we name things because they're like there, and they're not like, and that talks to us about the process of becoming because we don't have like this ethereal place where things are, but because things are right in front of us, acting on us. But that's contradictory in a way because he's Kantian, he's like believing in this like system of like metaphysics.
Oh, I didn't finish the thought. Here's the thought. Or did I? Kant and Plato are not the same.
Yeah, you did. You did
Oh,
say
okay, I
that.
did say that, but they really are not the same.
Yeah.
Okay, so meaning that precisely there are no eternal ideal forms for Kant. There are none. No, they change historically. That's Kant's
Yeah.
whole point. Yeah. So in
So
other words,
that you say is not exclusive from like the Bergson Aristotelian focus.
well, look, Plato and Aristotle established philosophy, and so pretty much everything is a kind of a footnote to them. However, it's more than a footnote because we're living in modernity, and nothing has happened quite like what's happened in the last 200 years. Right, and so we have to pay attention to how, I think Hegel said, philosophy was invented by Kant and completed by Hegel. Do you know that one? The 25 years of philosophy. Right. It's very, very important because it's meant very literally. It's not figurative at all, right? Which means that they're trying to explain what Plato and Aristotle really meant, but could not have known because humans had not recognized their freedom until the 1700s. And by the way, Marx agrees with this, right? Because he observes the fact that the bourgeois revolutions up to that point were carried out in religious terms. And even in the 18th century, still masked their own content by reference to classical antiquity, to ancient Rome in particular, right? The Roman Republic. That would be the American and French revolutions. Now, the American Revolution, less so than the French Revolution, disguised itself. The Americans were more, frankly, modern also because they were coming out of the British revolutionary tradition and Locke and the Glorious Revolution, which is much more secular. As Marx put it, the English Revolution of the 1600s went from Habakkuk to Locke. That's the phrase that Marx used, meaning Habakkuk is an Old Testament prophet, and Locke is the modern Enlightenment. And also, Marx said that there are two traditions of materialism, Descartes and Locke. Descartes and Locke. And that Locke's materialism leads to socialism. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of the way these things have been talked about, especially in the last 50 years, are not right. They're very, very distorted, extremely distorted. So Kant gets assimilated back to Plato. The thing in itself is turned into plain Platonic noumenal realm. And even though, like I said, it's not unambiguous what Plato meant by the noumenal realm. It's not unambiguous. But Kant is pretty clear about the historical changeability of it. So, where were you going with that?
That sometimes I feel like Benjamin is this contradiction that I haven't been able to understand.
He is contradictory. That's the point. To write dialectically means to actually say contradictory things from sentence to sentence, certainly from paragraph to paragraph.
So like Zizek?
I guess Zizek tries to do that sometimes. I'm trying to think of where he's getting that from, though. He's getting it from Freud and Lacan. He's getting this idea that we contradict ourselves in the sense of an unconscious denial. That's not, of course, where Marx or Marxism comes from, because it's not psychological. It's real, right? It's not just in our heads. It's not a function of our psychology. It's a function of our reality. And so therefore can't be addressed simply that way, right? So, yes, I mean, I think that Zizek does some of that. He does it very performatively, though, right? And again, for psychological effect. So that's a little different, because psychological effect, like recognizing self-contradiction as like your own psychology, is different from recognizing contradiction in the social world that has to be changed. The other thing about the contradiction in the social world is, and I don't know if we've had a chance to talk about this, but Marxism, and this is why Benjamin converted to Marxism by reading Lukács, because Lukács brought out the Hegelian dimension of Marxism, that otherwise, like popular Marxism or vulgar Marxism, really kind of played with this more at a propagandistic rhetorical level and didn't sort of squarely acknowledge it, which is that Marxism is different from other kinds of socialism in that other kinds of socialism are naive about their own ideological character, meaning they just sort of say, these are our values, this is what we want, this is what we're trying to achieve, this is how we're going to achieve it. Whereas Marxism understands that all of that is capitalism. All that's a function of capitalism. Meaning the idea is that the working class is going to struggle for socialism within ideology. It's going to ideologically misrecognize the true content of its own struggle. Therefore, all these things are subject to self-contradiction, and Marx and Engels, like their earliest works, are about how socialism and communism are self-contradictory ideologies. And that's why you got state socialists versus anarchists. You have all these varieties of socialists that directly contradict each other, and then within each faction, they also contradict themselves, right? So
Because of ideology.
right, because they are struggling for a continuation of the bourgeois revolution. They're trying to achieve transcendence of bourgeois society on the basis of bourgeois society, and therefore they're maintaining this value system in what they're aspiring for. Marx thought that is the way it has to happen. It will happen that way. However, it also is misrecognizing itself, and the result will be different from what people think they're struggling for. Yeah. So that's the tricky part, is the idea that we have to struggle for something while misrecognizing what we're actually struggling for. And so the idea is that capitalism is self-contradictory in a way that makes dealing with this inevitable. It generates misrecognitions that potentially mislead us. It means that the struggle for socialism will not only be internally contradictory at some theoretical level, but will actually involve people fighting against each other, both claiming to be socialists. But that's going to be what will happen. Right? And why that's important is that Benjamin is writing in a time when Marxism was divided. The Social Democrats and the Communists were blood enemies, even to the point that they could not unite against Hitler. Right? They each accused the other of being complicit with Hitler and were unable to unite against Hitler. Like, it was that severe. So I mentioned Rosa Luxemburg. She was killed by the Social Democrats. She was the founder of the German Communist Party. Her old party killed her. The people who ordered her death were literally her students from the party school where she taught. They were literally her students. I know. I'm very aware. I've been always aware of this. That's why I don't like the Cultural Revolution in China. Because I don't like the children to be encouraged to attack their professors. No, children, you have something to learn. You can't attack what you don't know. Not legitimately, anyway. All right, so history. And we're living in a different kind of history than Hegelian history, although we're also living in Hegelian history because Hegel has this idea. Just to round it out, Hegel has this idea that freedom is fought for through misrecognizing its content, and then we know what the struggle was about in hindsight. So we know after the fact, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, knowledge comes later, wisdom comes later, but in the moment, people think they're fighting for one thing, they're actually fighting for the opposite thing that they think that they're fighting for. And then afterwards, one can know what the old past struggle was about. So basically, Kant and Hegel were coming at the end of the bourgeois revolution, at the end of the process since the Renaissance in which society changed. And basically they were like, okay, now we can see what the last few hundred years was about because it's behind us. This revolution is now behind us. With Marx, it's the opposite. The revolution is current or ahead of us. It's not behind us. So we have to deal with the fact that we have to struggle without knowing. Because we don't have the benefit of hindsight struggling in the present. All right, so I mentioned the bourgeois revolution struggled under Protestantism, basically, through apostolic Christianity, through return to like original Jesus, right? That was the idea, against the Catholic Church. That was how the bourgeois revolution unfolded, starting in the Renaissance, humanism, but Protestantism. Then it thought that it was returning to the ancient republic. It thought it was restoring ancient democratic republicanism. So it was sort of picking up where the Greeks and the Romans left off. Right? But then finally it could recognize itself as not being, as transcending Christianity, transcending ancient democracy, transcending ancient republicanism. And the new world was recognized. And therefore history could be recognized in a certain sense. That was the end of the 1700s and the early 1800s. So that's basically the Kant-Hegel moment, is recognizing, okay, people thought they were struggling for one thing, it turned out they were not. They were not restoring Christianity nor restoring the ancient democracy or ancient republic. They were producing something brand new, totally unprecedented historically, but people had to think that they were restoring something old when they were fighting for something new. Now, Marxism also thinks that about the working class's struggle for socialism. I don't know if we've talked about this. I was trying to remember, did we ever look at the Horkheimer, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom? Oh, we did not. Hey, okay, maybe we should look at that. We'll come back around to that. You know, like Stalinism really did a number. Because it produced this undialectical opposition, bourgeois and proletarian. No. The whole point is that the working class is bourgeois. The working class is bourgeois. Proletarianization is the self-contradiction of the working class as bourgeois. Because in bourgeois terms, the working class cannot be a proletariat. So what is a proletariat? The ancient, did we talk about this? The ancient proletariat? No? So it's a term from the Roman Empire, the proletari.
Oh.
Yeah, so the proletari were the citizens of Rome who had rights because they were citizens of Rome, but they had no property. So their contribution, and therefore they were not part of the aristocracy, basically. They're tribally Roman, but not aristocratic, because ancient democracy is aristocratic. So ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the people who participate in the democracy and in the republic are the aristocracy. They're the nobility, basically. So the proletari they're part of the tribe that conquered the other people, the Romans, but Roman civilization developed so that not everyone could have property. Not everyone could have the fruit of conquest. And yet they were not slaves either. So they were the proletari. And the meaning of the word proletari means, literally, the people who reproduce. Meaning their only contribution to the Roman state is offspring. Right? That's what the working class is. The working class in capitalism are not bourgeois subjects. They're rather the people who reproduce the reserve army of labor, the surplus population that allows capitalism to continue. So that's what it means to call them proletarian, and yet they also seem to have been expropriated. Right, so their property, namely the value of their labor, has been expropriated from them, and so they are propertyless workers, which is actually a contradiction in terms, because before the Industrial Revolution, workers had property. Namely, they had their skills. They own their own tools. They own the means of production. In capitalism, they no longer own the means of production because the Industrial Revolution has expropriated them of the means of production. And as Marx put it, whereas the ancient proletariat lived at the expense of society, the modern proletariat society lives at the expense of the proletariat. Okay. It's also true the proletariat lives at the expense of society once they bring the welfare state in. Right? But that's like a restoration of the status of the Roman proletariat.
So you were saying Stalinism created this undialectical opposition between
Bourgeois and
class
proletarian,
and
yeah.
bourgeois.
Yeah.
But everyone is bourgeois, including the working class. So the fight for the revolution to overcome capitalism has to come from everyone. It's mean like not just like the
Has to come
proletarian rising against.
No, it has to come from the working class, but asserting their bourgeois rights. So basically asserting their rights as laborers, asserting their right to liberty, equality, fraternity.
So it's not about seizing the means of production.
It is, but in the name of restoring the rights that they feel like they've lost due to capitalist usurpation. Right. So thing is, in mainstream political discourse, people understand everything changed with the Industrial Revolution. So in American historical discourse, everyone knows that something fundamentally changed with the industrialization of the U.S. and that workers lost their rights, and therefore the state had to come in and compensate them for it. This is just mainstream liberal recognition. Everybody knows the state has to do something different now than it did in 1787 when the Constitution was formed, because the problem of industrial capitalism didn't yet exist. Right. So again, Marxism is not completely off the wall. What is off the wall is the dialectic. That's what's off the wall, and especially the Marxian dialectic, which is peculiar, because it isn't about resolving contradiction, it's about working through contradiction, because it's not behind us, it's still present. Meaning, Hegel can seem like he's resolving contradiction because he's talking about past contradiction and how past contradiction was overcome, whereas we're dealing with the present contradiction that is not overcome, namely capitalism. This gives a changed character to history, by the way. So, the Enlightenment, the 1700s, they thought about history in a very different way than people came to think about history in the 19th century. And so the question is, why does that change? So the 1700s, they had a different notion of progress. They also thought that they were restoring nature. Like if you look at the language of the American and French revolutions, it's no longer restoration of Christianity, nor restoration exactly of the ancient republic, or of ancient democracy, but it's a restoration of natural rights. It's to get rid of the decadent civilization and restore us to our true nature. Right, so again, it's a very kind of secular, very different notion than saying restoring Christianity or saying restoring the ancient republic. Because obviously one's religious, the other is political. This is like natural rights, which are not nearly political and involve the rights of people against the state. Right. So in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, a citizen didn't have any rights against the state. No, there were no civil liberties. There was no civil society. Everyone was part of the state. Everyone belonged to the state belonged to them. Whereas we recognize that there are rights that the state can't take away from us, inalienable rights. So where do those come from? They come from nature, but what is nature? It's this funny historical thing. And anyway, so we could see it as progress, but we could also see it as restoration. Whereas in the 19th century, that gets troubled. With Romanticism, with the aftermath of the French Revolution, there's a doubt about how we understand historical progress, whether any historical progress is made at all, whether there's a direction of history, whether restorative or transcendent. All of that comes into doubt and into crisis. So a new kind of appreciation of history, we could say, a new valuing of history, but also a new problem of history came with Romanticism. So Romanticism, in a way very different from the Enlightenment. Romanticism is very concerned with nuances of historical difference, nuances of historical change. Very subtle changes. Like changes from the High Middle Ages to the Late Middle Ages, or early Renaissance to Middle Renaissance to Late Renaissance. Like every little change is very important. So literally changes within ancient Roman history, in ancient Greece, changes in the way people experience things aesthetically, the way they conceived of things philosophically, the way they practiced things morally. Nietzsche was a classical philologist, so I think that we talked about this maybe previously. So he studied ancient languages, and he and his friends, his colleagues, studied traditional civilizations like across the world. So he had friends who studied ancient China, ancient India, the Arab world, the medieval world, did biblical exegesis, right? The ancient Israelites. They were also like anthropologists and archaeologists. They studied cultures outside the domain of the tradition of, I don't know what you'd call it, the Eastern Hemisphere as opposed to the Western Hemisphere. So there were people who were studying the Native Americans. There were people who were studying African peoples and Polynesian peoples. So there were Sanskritists, right? So people who studied Indian, like literature, scripture. Generally, it came out of biblical exegesis. So the idea that when you study the Bible, when you look at the Old Testament, in particular, what you're seeing is like historical changes in the way people conceived of God. And it's like in the language itself. So it's like this very close reading that shows how people meant different things, even when they were using the same words, or they used the words differently. So Nietzsche's trained in this as a classical philologist. So he studies the Greeks and the Romans. This is a romantic discipline. This is a discipline that really was established in the turn of the 19th century. Right, so again, very much concerned with how the past is different from us, how we're different, how they were different, how we're different. So cultural differences, historical differences, nuances of those differences. All right, so Peter Preuss gives us a good explanation of Nietzsche's concerns here, so let's see what he has to say. Again, this is from the Hackett edition of the Nietzsche text. Man, unlike the animal, is self-conscious. He is aware that he is alive and that he must die. And because he is self-conscious, he is not only aware of living, but of living well or badly. Life is not wholly something that happens to man. It is also something he engages in according to values he follows. Human existence is a task. In the past 2 centuries or so of European philosophizing, so this is written in the 1980s, there have been a number of attempts to clarify this task, the Hegelian elevation of individual finitude into infinity in the absolute, meaning everything changes except for one thing, namely freedom. So what's infinite is freedom because it's boundless. The Kierkegaardian life of inwardness, and the Heideggerian authentic life of preparation for the self-revelation of being, among others. Nietzsche, too, understands human existence to be a task. He calls it simply the task of living. As with any genuine philosophy of this kind, his attempt to clarify philosophically the task of human existence is itself always part of the same task. It is not written from an assumed standpoint outside of human existence, merely viewing that existence dispassionately and objectively, but is written from the standpoint of a human being engaged in this task, fully aware that he is so engaged. Not only is Nietzsche aware that philosophizing is part of the task of existence, he also insists that every human enterprise is part of the task. Whatever a person does finally receives its meaning only insofar as it is integrated into the total task of existing. If it fails to further this task, it is valueless. If it hinders this task, it is to be rejected. The topic of the present work is the relation between life and historical knowledge. The quest for knowledge and truth is also part of the task of existing, and like every human enterprise, it receives its value from being integrated into the task of which it is part. Well, what if some knowledge, some truth, should prove deadly? What if, with respect to some knowledge, we are faced with the alternative, know the truth and die, or live and remain in error? According to Nietzsche, we are faced with this alternative, but given the choice between life and knowledge, he argues, there is no question about which we ought to choose. Any knowledge which destroys life destroys itself, for knowledge presupposes life. The 19th century had discovered history, and all subsequent inquiry and education bore the stamp of this discovery. This was not simply the discovery of a set of facts about the past, but the discovery of the historicity of man. Man, unlike the animal, is a historical being. Man is not wholly the product of an alien act, either natural or divine, but in part produces his own being. The task of existing is a task precisely because it is not a case of acting according to a permanent nature or essence, but rather of producing that nature within the limitations of the situation. History is the record of this self-production. It is the activity of a historical being recovering the past into a present which anticipates the future. With a total absence of this activity, man would fall short of humanity, therefore history is necessary. But what if this activity is perverted? What if, rather than remaining the life-promoting activity of a historical being, history is turned into the objective uncovering of mere facts by the disinterested scholar? Facts to be left as they are found, to be contemplated without being assimilated into present being. According to Nietzsche, this perversion has taken place, and history, rather than promoting life, has become deadly. This, then, is the dilemma Nietzsche faced. History is necessary, but as it is practiced, it is deadly. The present work is an attempt to extricate himself and us from this dilemma. All right, so this essay is one of 4 untimely meditations or unfashionable observations, early essays. One was about a left Hegelian David Strauss. I'm trying to remember what the other, I think that's the first one. So, history as discovered and practiced in the 19th century had become deadly. That's historicism. That's the term that Benjamin uses. It's historicism. It's this objective view of history. But history has no content other than subjectively. Right? Again, we're back with Kant. Kant's about the reality of the subject. It's about establishing the substance of the subject. Or as Hegel put it, the self-moving substance that is subject. So it's history has become objectivistic. It's become reified. The facts have been made into reifications. Facts of history. By the way, I mentioned that Benjamin was converted to Marxism by Lukács. So Lukács, in his essay on reification, raises historicism as a key phenomenon of reification. Says this objective view of history is itself an expression of capitalism. It's an expression of how the dynamics of historical change under capitalism are alienated from us and therefore appear to be objective in the sense of existing apart from us, like a natural force. So, and we engage in all sorts of reified disciplines like sociology, political science, that try to objectively explain why humans do what they do. Psychology is another one. Tries to objectively explain what humans do as if we're not subjects of our own existence, but are rather objects of some other force. We just put nature in the place that God used to be. And we try to determine the course of things based on quantifications and statistics as if we're talking about the weather. Whereas obviously we're talking about society and politics and things that we are actually doing, and doing with intention. But we treat it as if we were looking at an anthill.
But it's curious that while Nietzsche is critical
Mhm.
of this historicism, he constantly chooses wording that describes history as an external force.
Yep.
So,
Well, he does his best to use language that exists,
okay.
but also get us to denaturalize, think about what's meant by that. Now, all these metaphysical concepts, like history, like ultimately, metaphysics has religious origins. And so it used to be pretty straightforward. Why did things happen? Because it was the will of God, or the gods, or the divine forces. That's why things happened. So in other words, we attributed to an external force what the Enlightenment, Kant, Hegel, thought, oh, that was our doing, but we called it God's doing. We made it seem like God made it happen, but actually that was us. Right, so Marx talks about it as alienation, right? That basically the first form of alienation is religion. But it's also a self-recognition, meaning what we attributed to God was our own doing, which means that we were recognizing our own doing, but in an alienated way. Indeed, that's the whole point of capitalism. Capital doesn't exist apart from us. It is us. To call it capitalism, to say that society is dominated by capital, is to simply say we dominate ourselves in a particular way that we treat as if it's external to us and outside of us, and like a natural force acting upon us. But it is us. So history is like that, meaning history is just what we do, and yet we come to think of it as having an existence above and beyond us. Right, so even though Kant and Hegel tried to bring these metaphysical categories down to earth, in capitalism they've achieved escape velocity again. So the way Nietzsche uses the term history is the practice of history. Right, so let me see something. There's might be another version. But
Can't wait to figure out what the pet shop plays videos.
oh, being boring. It's a good one. It's a good one. There we go. Maybe during the break I'll play it. So speaking of advantage and disadvantage, there's an advantage and disadvantage to the two translations. So both translations are good, but there are advantages to. Oh yeah, here we go. All right, let's look at the beginning. Moreover, I hate everything which merely instructs me without increasing or directly quickening my activity. These are Goethe's words, with which, as with a boldly expressed ceterum censeo, we may begin our consideration of the worth and worthlessness of history. So what's a ceterum censeo? All right, so footnote. This is an allusion to Cato's ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delenda. So, moreover, I am of the opinion that Carthage be destroyed, with which he used to conclude every speech on any topic whatever,
until you finally go to the Romans into the Third Punic War. All right, so why is that important? It's actually going to come up with Benjamin, when Benjamin will say, he'll quote, I think Flaubert, how sad one it would have to be to want the resurrection of Carthage. However, that is in fact what the Europeans in the Enlightenment wanted in the 1700s. So Enlightenment thinkers, looking at the course of human history, of European history, of human history up to that point, but the dominance of Europe, they regretted the fact that Rome had defeated Carthage. Why? Because Rome was an empire based on conquest. Carthage was an empire based on trade. So they thought if Carthage had won, if Hannibal had won, we could have skipped all this crap, the Middle Ages, we could have skipped all that and gone directly to where we are now. We could have gone to bourgeois society directly from Carthage. Right. So it's a loaded reference. Okay. It says, our aim will be to show why instruction, which fails to quicken activity, why knowledge, which enfeebles activity, why history as a costly intellectual excess and luxury must, in the spirit of Goethe's words, be seriously hated. For we still lack what is most necessary, and superfluous excess is the enemy of the necessary. Certainly we need history, but our need for history is quite different from that of the spoiled idler in the garden of knowledge. By the way, this is what Benjamin will quote in the concept of history essay that we'll read in the final week. Even if he, in his refinement, looks down on our rude and graceless requirements and needs. That is, we require history for life and action, not for the smug avoiding of life and action, or even to whitewash a selfish life and cowardly bad acts. Only so far as history serves life will we serve it. But there is a degree of doing history and an estimation of it which brings with it a withering and degenerating of life, a phenomenon which is now as necessary as it may be painful to bring to consciousness through some remarkable symptoms of our age. I have made an effort to describe a feeling which has tortured me often enough. I revenge myself on it by making it public. So, you guys who are artists or really any writers, remember that that's what you're doing. Whenever you're writing about anything or making anything, you are taking a painful feeling and having your revenge on it by inflicting it on others. Perhaps this description will give someone occasion to explain to me that he too knows this feeling, but that I have not felt it purely and originally enough, and have quite failed to articulate it with the confidence and mature experience due to it. A few may think so perhaps, but most will tell me that this is a quite perverted, unnatural, repulsive, and downright impermissible feeling. Even that with this feeling I have shown myself to be quite unworthy of the mighty historical orientation of the age, which, as is well known, has been evident for 2 generations, particularly among the Germans. At any rate, my daring to come forward with a natural description of my feeling will sooner promote than injure general propriety. For in doing so, I give opportunity to many to pay compliments to this orientation of the age. For my part, however, I gain something I value more highly than general propriety, public instruction, and correction at our age. These reflections are also untimely, because I attempt to understand as a defect, infirmity, and shortcoming of the age, something of which our age is justifiably proud, its historical education. I even believe that all of us suffer from a consuming historical fever, and should at least realize that we suffer from it. If Goethe has said with good reason that with our virtues we also cultivate our faults, and if, as everyone knows, a hypertrophic virtue, which the historical sense of our age seems to me to be, may bring about the decay of a people as much as a hypertrophic vice, one may well allow me my say. I should not hide the exonerating circumstance that I have for the most part taken the experiences which those painful feelings occasion in me from myself, and have considered those of others only for the sake of comparison, and that further only so far as I am the nursling of more ancient times, especially the Greek, could I come to have such untimely experience about myself as a child of the present age? That much I must be allowed to grant myself on the grounds of my profession as a classical philologist. For I do not know what meaning classical philology would have for our age, if not to have an untimely effect within it. That is, to act against the age, and to have an effect on the age to the advantage, it is to be hoped, of a coming age. Meaning, by reference to the past, one can change the future. Be very important for Benjamin. Okay, so let's begin to talk about Benjamin's categories here. All right, so he starts with the animal. So he used the term anthropomorphism. With Nietzsche, he's known for zoomorphism. So he did that a little bit already with the mosquito, right? So, and the clever animals. So zoomorphism means making humans into animals as opposed to making animals into humans. And he does that very famously in On the Genealogy of Morals, where he talks about the aristocracy as birds of prey. And he talks about the blonde beast, by which he meant the lions, right? So the kind of kick-ass people, the blonde races, by which he meant the Arabs, the Japanese, and the Germans. Why were they blonde? Because they were like lions, because they were conquering peoples, not because they had blonde hair. No, he didn't mean that at all. It's just stupidity. Like, the Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche is really stupid. It's really stupid. It's really stupid. So he does zoomorphism. But he also, look, humans are animals. We are animals. So there's an appropriateness to it. Animals are not humans, but humans are animals. Consider the herd grazing before you. These animals do not know what yesterday and today are, but leap about, eat, rest, digest, and leap again. And so from morning to night and from day to day, only briefly concerned with their pleasure and displeasure, enthralled by the moment, and for that reason neither melancholy nor bored. It is hard for man to see this, for he is proud of being human and not an animal, and yet regards its happiness with envy, because he wants nothing other than to live like the animal, neither bored nor in pain. Yet wants it in vain, because he does not want it like the animal. Man may well ask the animal, why do you not speak to me of your happiness, but only look at me? The animal does want to answer and say, because I always immediately forget what I wanted to say. And then it already forgot this answer and remained silent, so that man could only wonder. Is that a Kafkaesque? That's very Kafka. It's very Kafka. But he also wondered about himself, that he cannot learn to forget, but always remains attached to the past. However far and fast he runs, the chain runs with him. It is astonishing. The moment, here in a wink, gone in a wink, nothing before and nothing after, returns nevertheless as a specter to disturb the calm of a later moment. Again and again, a page loosens and the scroll of time drops out and flutters away, and suddenly flutters back again into man's lap. Now remember what Benjamin said about the flitting by on the mimetic faculty, meaning flits by. Nietzscheanism. Then man says, I remember, and envies the animal, which immediately forgets and sees each moment really die, sink back into deep night, extinguished forever. In this way, the animal lives unhistorically. For it goes into the present like a number without leaving a curious fraction. It does not know how to dissimulate, hides nothing, appears at every moment fully as what it is, and so cannot but be honest. Man, on the other hand, resists the great and ever greater weight of the past. This oppresses him and bends him sideways, and encumbers his gait like an invisible and sinister burden, which for the sake of appearances he may deny at times, and which in intercourse with his equals he is all too pleased to deny, to excite their envy. This is why he is moved, as though he remembered a lost paradise when he sees a grazing herd, or
In more intimate proximity sees a child, which as yet has nothing past to deny, playing between the fences of past and future in blissful ignorance. And yet the child's play must be disturbed. Only too soon will it be called out of its forgetfulness. Then it comes to understand the phrase "it was," that password with which struggle, suffering, and boredom approach man to remind him what his existence basically is, and never be to be completed imperfect tense. And when death finally brings longed-for forgetfulness, it also robs him of the present and of existence, and impresses its seal on this knowledge, that existence is only an uninterrupted having been, a thing which lives by denying itself, consuming itself, and contradicting itself. There's actually a phrase of Nietzsche. Let's see if I can find it. I have it posted for another class. It's earlier than this. So here's Nietzsche. Fate and history. As soon as it becomes possible by dint of a strong will to overthrow the entire past of the world, then in a single moment we will join the ranks of independent gods. World history for us will then be nothing but a dreamlike otherworldly being. The curtain falls and man once again finds himself a child playing with whole worlds. A child awoken by the first glow of morning, who laughingly wipes the frightful dreams from his brow. That's the goal. That's the goal. Meaning, the goal is forgetfulness. We encountered this with Josephine the Singer. Redemption and forgetfulness. Redemption and forgetfulness. Okay, so let's look at the categories that Nietzsche has. So he's got the three kinds of history. He's got the monumental. Well, they keep these a good bit.
I think it's a rational brand, though. Like, Crayola. I don't think I think it ruined the word.
It will ruin the board. That's the last one that we have left. It's gotta be useful. Oh, we got some stuff in there. Hold on. I didn't realize we got some. Ah. Excellent. Okay. Let's start this again. Alright, so he's got three kinds of history. Monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. Got a kind of dynamic here, where we move. The first kind of history is the monumental, then we'll see we move to the antiquarian and finally to the critical, and then we kind of start the cycle all over again. Alright, so that is the three ways of being historical. But then there's another dynamic, and these are actually the main categories of Nietzsche's essay, not these, but rather these. Namely, the unhistorical, the historical, and the suprahistorical. So there's a dynamic here. You could say, so the dynamic according to which the types of history unfold. Now, we've talked about this with Proust and Bertolt about historical, namely memory or remembrance or remembering. Now, every form of remembering is also a form of forgetting. Well, when we remember something a certain way, it means also forgetting it in another way. So actually, we can't separate the way we remember from the way we forget. And if you recall, Proust deals with this with the voluntary and involuntary memory. So is he struggling to remember his past, or is he struggling to forget his past? That's the fundamental ambivalence of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, is that he's writing his autobiography, but in writing his autobiography, he's trying to live the life he didn't live. So he's actually trying to forget his life by trying to remember it. He's trying to overcome his melancholy through memory. There's a kind of paradox there. So we can't be like the animals. We can't have forgetfulness or the unhistorical the way the animals do. Okay, so the unhistorical is the animal. Historical is the human. So what is the superhistorical? Well, of course, it's the superhuman. It's the superhuman. Now why? Well, because unlike the animal, we change. Meaning being human means to be superhuman. Meaning we are human, we're Homo sapiens, we're a primate species, but what defines our existence is that we transcend that. And that we constantly transcend it. And that we transcend the way we've transcended it in the past, we transcend differently in the future. So this is, by the way, the much maligned or feared Overman, the superhuman, Nietzsche. No, we are superhuman. So the question is, how are we tasked with being superhuman now? Meaning overcoming this form of humanity.
Nietzsche, he writes, while there has been such sonorous talk of the free personality, one doesn't even see personalities, not to speak of free ones, rather nothing but timidly disguised universal man. He also, it's like the opposite of the superhuman, universal man.
Okay, so the question is, what's the status of universal man? Meaning, on the one hand, it doesn't exist, on the other hand, it must mean something, otherwise we wouldn't have a concept of it. Right? And even if it's a self-deception, it would still be meaningful. Right? Because then the question would be, well, why do we deceive ourselves this way? Right? What is it actually referring to? What is it that we're deceiving ourselves about through the self-deception? Right? So there's a truth in the deception. That's the point. Again, the parallel with Marx is important. Why is the parallel with Marx important? Because it's important for Benjamin. That's why. Meaning, who knows whether this close parallel between Nietzsche and Marx exists? Benjamin thinks there's good grounds for it. There are other reasons why we might think so, namely that both Nietzsche and Marx are living in the aftermath of German idealism, Kant and Hegel. They're both dealing with the problem of the legacy of German idealism in the era of capitalism. Now, of course, Nietzsche thinks about it differently than Marx. Marx thinks about it in terms of industrial production, the 19th century. Nietzsche, like Heidegger later, tends to think of it as Western civilization, which is a much looser way of grasping it. It turns it into a thousands of years problem as opposed to a hundreds of years problem. And is sort of naive about, like, is there such a thing as Western civilization? Or is it a kind of an invention of the modern era? Right? Whereas Marxism would be a lot clearer. Well, maybe it's an ex post facto invention of bourgeois society, this concept of Western civilization. And then the reason that people get so twisted about it in the 19th century is because of capitalism. Meaning, in comparison to the 18th century, which was much more cosmopolitan, much more universalistic, right? Much more concerned with the humanity of the non-West than fearful about the loss of humanity with the loss of the West, right? They weren't worried about the end of Western civilization in the 1700s. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, suddenly everybody's worried about the end of Western civilization. In the 18th century, it's like, Western civilization, it came and went, so it's fine. Like, there's still humanity, right? Civilizations rise and fall.
And the reason for this shift is capitalism.
Yes. Because it doesn't look like, civilization rises and falls. It looks much more faithful. Now, let me wait, you were saying something about
Universal man?
universal myth.
Yeah.
Universal myth. Okay. What page are you on in, or which section maybe?
It was paragraph 5, page, but I think I read another translation.
Oh, you had another one?
Yeah.
So neither this nor this?
Yeah, it's page 29.
Okay, let's see. Page, which one?
No, it's the other translation.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, it's this one. Okay, good. The hacker.
29.
Is it in section 5?
Yeah.
Oh, section 5. Okay. Okay. So it's in.
It's the next page.
The next page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Slightly longer. Yeah, here.
Individual.
Universal man, yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's see what it says this up. Oh, okay, right, all right. So he says, it comes to this, he has annihilated and lost his instinct. When his reason wavers and his way leads through deserts, he can no longer let go of the reins and trust in the divine animal. So the individual becomes timid and unsure and may no longer believe in himself. He sinks into himself, into his inner being, which here only means into the heaped up chaos of knowledge which fails to have an external effect, of teaching which does not become life. If we regard their outside, we notice how the expulsion of the instincts by history has almost transformed men into downright abstractus and shadows. No one dares to show his person, but masks himself as an educated man, as a scholar, a poet, a politician. If one takes hold of such masks, believing them to be real and not just a puppet show, for they all pretend to be real, one suddenly has hold of nothing but rags and multicolored patches. Therefore, one ought no longer to allow oneself to be deceived. Therefore, one ought to address them imperiously, take off your jackets, and be what you seem. No longer shall everyone who is serious by nature become a Don Quixote, for they have better things to do than fight with such presumed realities. At least each ought to look closely, call his halt who goes there to each mask and tear it off. How strange. One should think that history would, above all, encourage men to be honest, even if it were to be an honest fool. And it has always had this effect, but no longer. Historical education and the universal frock of the citizen rule at the same time. While there has never been such sonorous talk of the free personality, one does not even see personalities, not to speak of free ones, rather nothing but timidly disguised universal men. the individual has withdrawn into his inner being, externally one discerns nothing of him anymore, whereby one may doubt whether there can be any causes without effects. Or is a race of eunuchs required to guard the great historical world harem? Pure objectivity is most becoming in such men, of course. It almost seems as though the task were to guard history so that nothing can come of it but stories, but by no means history-making events. To prevent its making personalities free, that is sincere towards themselves, sincere towards others, and that in word and deed. Okay, so let's, so he's talking about the way we imagine the past in the present, right? So do we imagine that people in the past, like he brings in Don Quixote, are somehow out of step with their time? That there's a sort of conflict between inner and outer? Because that's what he's getting at. He comes back to this at the end. Right, so he sees the appearance of a conflict between inner and outer as a symptom. So he says, we don't start with that conflict between inner and outer, and then we experience it, but then we have to overcome it. And so we have to sort of no longer have the conflict between inner and outer. But if we do have this conflict between inner and outer, then suddenly when we look at history, it looks like history is a conflict between inner and outer. It looks like the personalities of the past were afflicted with the same problem we have now. And the reason for that is that we see universal men, meaning we see the same condition across everybody at all times. And he's saying, well, no, this is something specific to our time. This is what's happening to us now. Right, so here's another way of thinking about it, which is history determined or is it voluntaristic? Meaning, do people make history or does history make people? I think that I mentioned that Marx has this phrase in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. He says, men make history, but not according to conditions that they choose.
Can you repeat that?
Men make history, but not according to conditions that they choose. Meaning, we do change things, but we change what exists, and what exists is not our choice. Right, so that's the paradox. The paradox is that we fall into this antinomy. Either human action is of no consequence, things just happen, or humans make history just according to their own will, and neither is true. Right? So we do have a will, we do act, but we act on conditions that we ourselves did not choose. Now, we've talked about this before in terms of
We're talking about superhuman. That's why.
yes. So superhuman just means transcendent of the existing form of humanity, or like superhistorical just means transcending the form of the historical that exists. So remember I did the Drake meme with you guys? Drake meme. Yes. So it is not past, present, future, but it is the interaction of the past and the present which generates the future. So, and there are various ways of thinking about this. One is linearity. The other is that the past is just this sort of dead, inert stuff, and then we act on it. And then that generates the future, but in a way that kind of also makes the present and the future into like a dead thing by virtue of thinking of it this way. Whereas if we understand that, according to Faulkner, who Benjamin was going to write an essay on but didn't get around to it, the past is not dead, it's not even past. So we talked about that. And Bergson, the idea that everything that exists is the continued action of the past. Meaning, all the action that went into manufacturing this chair is still acting. All the energy that went into building this thing is still acting. So the past continues to act, and we interact with that action. And it's through that interaction that the future emerges. So it's not like we leave the past behind, because then the present becomes very uncertain. Like in this view, it seems like everything is past and future, and the present just sort of shrinks into this kind of unaccountable place. So, this would also, like I said, determinism versus voluntarism, meaning everything is determined or everything is a matter of free will. So either there's no free will or everything is free will. And it's like, well, no. There is free will, but not everything is a function of free will. We can do things, we can act, we can change things, but not just completely de novo out of nothing. So I think when we talk about this being and becoming, we talk about the dialectic of being and becoming and how really impossible it is for us to think about what we need to think about transformation, because it's two contradictory things, continuity and change. So there's change, but there's also continuity. Which means if there's continuity, there seems to be no change. If there's change, then there seems to be no continuity. No, there's both. There's both. Right, so there is change, but there's also continuity. And thinking both is almost impossible. Also because all the language that we have inherited from the past, all change was God's act. It's God's act, and it came from nowhere. It came out of the blue. Boom. It was unexpected. Therefore, it couldn't possibly be our action. It had to be God's action. Okay, so again, to overcome this antinomy of determinism and free will is the task. And when thinking about history, again, is history determined or is it a matter of the will of the actors? It's both and neither. So Marx uses the term conditions. So the past conditions the present, but doesn't determine it. And I think if I'm remembering my Latin correctly, condite, conditions, means speaking with. So the past doesn't determine the present, but speaks with the present. All right, so when thinking about history, okay, let's talk about the types of history here. So monumental history is the first kind of history that we do. It's the first kind of history that we enact. So it's the great events and great figures of the past. And we know that they're great. It's canonical history. We know that they're great events and great figures because they made us who we are. And it doesn't matter whether they happened 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago, they remain important. They're foundational. Right, so canonical history is concerned with the things that define our values. So in some ways, it's not really historical at all, meaning the past is present. Jesus lives. It's evergreen. It never gets old. It's always equally relevant. Right? The Supreme Court wonders what the Founding Fathers meant. And not ludicrously, because we might have regressed. Meaning they might have something over us. That's important too. And the founding fathers also include, or the founders is what they say now, include all the writers of all the amendments. So the Reconstruction Amendments also are founding documents. Okay, so monumental history. We know our values, and therefore we know the meaning and value of the past. Because we know our present values, we know what in the past is valuable. Because our present values tell us what was important and valuable about the past. He thinks that every people, every civilization, every culture starts out that way and then eventually progresses or changes. In other words, whether it progresses or degenerates, it doesn't matter. Comes to a place where its values are no longer clear, are no longer certain. Therefore, you can't discriminate between what's important and what's not important about the past. It all equally seems equally important or equally unimportant. So we no longer feel like we only need to remember the important things because we no longer know what the important things are. So instead, we have to remember everything. And that's antiquarian history. And the reason that we have to remember everything is that we're not sure what's valuable and what's not valuable, so we keep it all. We hoard it. We're uncertain of our values, and therefore we feel like everything in the past is important. That's antiquarian history. But it's also strangely dead history in comparison to monumental history. Monumental history, the past is alive. Antiquarian history, the past is dead. It's the past and knowledge and truth and our values are things that are in a library or in a museum. That's our time. Starting in the 1800s, historicism. So everything is the history of everything. Meaning, the best example I can use of this is philosophy. Like in philosophy departments. Does anyone do philosophy? No, they do the history of philosophy. Or when they try to do philosophy, they try to do it in a completely ahistorical way. They do it as pure logic. Right? So it's either completely presentist or it's totally antiquarian past. But the relation between the two? No. You either do continental philosophy, in which case you're doing history of philosophy, or you do analytic philosophy, in which case you're doing a presentism that ignores, right? That only treats it as a kind of logical operation. So antiquarian history is what happens when a culture no longer knows its values. It's a symptom. It's a symptom of what Nietzsche later calls, in his later works, the transvaluation of values. So when our values are changing, we become uncertain of them. But it's a pathology of transition. So here's another, I think that I don't know whether I mentioned this or not. So he's got the great expression, illness. So the illness of the time, the illness of the late 1800s. It's an illness, but it's an illness the way pregnancy is an illness. Meaning it has within it the possibility of a new life, of a new form of life. And so the point is not to cure it, but to go through it, to undergo it. And yes, it involves a lot of suffering, and it's dangerous, but it's necessary for life to continue. So he called the nihilism of the modern era a symptom of this transition in our values. So because we're Going from the old values to new values that we don't know what they are yet, we experience it as the loss of value. Anomie, I think I mentioned Durkheim, the sociologist, whose concept of anomie, that the modern world is afflicted with anomie. And his first major study was on suicide, why poor people killed themselves in modern society in a way that didn't happen before. Because for ancient peoples, the only people who would kill themselves would be the ruling class, because they had values that they needed to preserve, so they would kill themselves rather than dishonor their own values. So it was a way of preserving the value of life to kill yourself, whereas modern suicide is about life losing its value to people, such that even poor people can't just live, they have to kill themselves because they can't deal with what's going on. So it's a pathology of transition. Antiquarian history is a symptom of this. He calls it drowning in the dust of bibliographic quizquilia. All knowledge is a historical reference. Okay, so what does that do? It creates a situation where we are overwhelmed by all of this massive data that we can't make sense of, and then finally we have to choose. We have to say, fuck it. No, this is important, and that is not important. And that's critical history. Critical history, it's literally kritikos, it's Greek, it means decision. Criticals, like crisis, it's a decision point, a decision has to be made. You know, we're keeping all the data, but at a certain point we have to decide what's worth remembering and what's forgetting. And then when we choose, we establish a new canon. And we come full circle back to monumental history. So we decide these are the great events and great figures, great actions of the past that matter, that made us who we are, because now we know who we are. And we establish a new canon, but then eventually we'll go through the same crisis and come to a decision point again. So this is a pattern that repeats itself. So he thought...
When you say we, are we like...
Any community. So he thinks that any civilization goes through these phases. Like, in other words, the ancient Greeks went through these three phases, the ancient Romans went through these phases, the European civilization went through these phases, and now modern society is going through this. Right, so there was like, you know, a kind of monumental Middle Ages, then there was an antiquarian Middle Ages, and then there was a critical Middle Ages, right? So now, like the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries have moved through this, and he thinks that his time is a time, at least anticipating, if not yet, doing it, of critical history. Now this is important because Benjamin's going to agree. So he's going to see historicism.
Is this the eternal return?
Not exactly. So the eternal return of the same is, we'll talk about it a little bit today, but we'll also talk about it in coming weeks. So it's from the Will to Power. It's this idea that if a demon came to you and said, or a jinn came to you, a genie came to you, and said, you can live your life again, but the only thing is, you'd have to live it exactly the way you did before. This is Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, love your fate, meaning you only have one life, and so you should love it, because that's it. That's your life. The only value your life has is to you, and therefore you need to love your existence, you need to love your fate. So would you live your life over again? Yes, you would. And you would live it over exactly how you lived it before, because after all, it is who you are. It's what made you who you are. It is you. Right? So this idea that, like the melancholic idea, which is that somehow one is different from one's own life, how would that be possible? Well, of course, it would be possible if there's a potential in one's life that goes unrealized. And that's redemption, which we've talked about. All right, so the ancient peoples had a way of thinking about that, which is reincarnation or life after death, life in the forever after, and at the end of history. We talked about that. So the Messiah comes, we did do this, the theological political fragment? Yeah, the Messiah comes to redeem your unhappiness so that you have in paradise what you didn't have in life. And that's why you're brought back in your body, to have the bodily happiness that was denied you in life. Right? But whether or not that's going to happen, we don't know whether that's going to happen. Probably not going to happen. But anyway, maybe it will happen, but that says nothing about what we have to do in history. What we have to do in life, in time. Because that's outside of time. So as we're in time, we have to decide what we're going to do. We have to choose our values, choose our activity. Or we can try to avoid it by treating existence as if it's objective, outside of us, something else. And again, the only reason why we would deny that we're being subjective is because we're uncertain what our values are. In other words, objectivity is a mask for our inability to claim our values. Because we do have our values, whether we acknowledge them or not. So when we pretend we don't have any values, what we're actually expressing is confusion as to our values.
And like back to the first Nietzsche we read today, how can we know what our values are without truth being truth, like epistemology, right? Like the way we know. So if we don't have a sense of truth, then how can we decide which are our values morally?
Well, that would be a symptom. In other words, we have our truths. We do. We know what our values are at some level. We might deny them, but no, they're there. The truth changes. So we talked about this with Kant. So does our realization that the truth changes invalidate the notion of truth? It should not. It should not. Just because the truth is not eternal doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. In fact, the truth of truth is that it changes. And that it changes, we change it. We change it.
You said just because truth isn't eternal?
Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Again, we're trapped in ancient metaphysics. We are. It's in our language. It might even be psychologically our predisposition to maintain things as they are. We don't have that luxury. You know, capitalism is rolling.
Sorry, I'm jumping from one
Yeah,
thing
go ahead.
to another. But, so back to this Nietzsche, you were
Mhm.
saying amor fati. So is the superhuman embracing amor fati? Like, is that overcoming the task of history? Like,
Amor fati is more the present. Like, in
Yeah,
other words,
of course, yeah.
you have to accept how your life has led you to this, where you are now. And actually, it's very Hegelian, because Hegel's very presentist also, meaning Hegel thinks one has to grasp the necessity of the present, rather than the Romantics, who thought that the present was like an accident or a kind of mistake, or like we took a wrong turn, like we're here, you know, through some, again, arbitrary, inessential thing happened. And it's like, well, no. It must have happened for a reason. We did it, so we must have done it for some reason. And even if it's a mistake, that's still meaningful. So when we treat the present as an arbitrary accident or a mistake, we're denying its necessity. To grasp its necessity doesn't mean to apologize for it, doesn't mean to rationalize it. It does not mean that. Right? Yet this is what we're always faced with. We either embrace the present and therefore apologize and justify it, or we deny it, as if we're disavowing responsibility for it. Did we do the W? No, we did not. Hegel? Okay. We'll do this and then we'll take a little break. Oh no, we've gone way too late. Okay, hold on. Let's see if I've got this in our apparatus. I think that I have it in this class at least. I thought that I had it in our class too. No. Let's see. That's not possible. Alright, let's see if it's in our class. Oh. We did not. We have not. Okay. We'll look at Hegel and W.E.B. Du Bois. Do you guys know who Du Bois is? So he's a Black American philosopher. Studied in Germany. Was a Hegelian. Became a Marxist of some kind. But let's see what Hegel says, and then we'll see what Du Bois says. So Hegel says, when we look at this drama of human passions and observe the consequences of their violence and of the unreason that is linked not only to them, but also and especially to good intentions and rightful aims, when we see arising from them all the evil, the wickedness, and the decline of the most flourishing nations mankind has produced, we can only be filled with grief for all that has come to nothing. And since this decline and fall is not merely the work of nature, but of the will of men, we might well end with moral outrage over such a drama, and with the revolt of our good spirit, if there is a spirit of goodness in us. Without rhetorical exaggeration, we can paint the most fearful picture of the misfortunes suffered by the noblest of nations and states, as well as by private virtues. And with that picture, we can arouse feelings of the deepest and most helpless sadness, not to be outweighed by any consoling outcome. We can strengthen ourselves against this, or escape it, only by thinking that, well, so it was at one time. It is fated. It is fate. There is nothing to be done about it now. And finally, in order to cast off the tediousness that this reflection of sadness can produce in us, and to return to involvement in our own way, to the present and our own aims and interests, we return to the selfishness of standing on a quiet shore where we can be secure in enjoying the distant sight of confusion and wreckage. But as we contemplate history as the slaughter bench, upon which the happiness of nations, the wisdom of states, and the virtues of individuals were sacrificed, the question necessarily comes to mind: what was the ultimate goal for which these monstrous sacrifices were made? World history is the progress in the consciousness of freedom, a progress that we must come to know in its necessity. The Orientals knew that only one person is free. That's your God Emperor, that's your Pharaoh. The Greeks and Romans, that some are free. Those are your citizens, your aristocracy. While we moderns know that all humans are implicitly free as human. The final goal of the world, we said, is spirit's consciousness of its freedom, and hence also the actualization of that very freedom. It is this final goal, freedom, towards which all of the world's history has been working. It is this goal to which all the sacrifices have been brought upon the broad altar of the earth in the long flow of time. Now here's Du Bois. It's from Black Reconstruction in America, which you wrote in the 30s. And it's about the Civil War and the aftermath and the defeat of Reconstruction. So, Du Bois says, the most magnificent drama of the last 1,000 years of world history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of that mother continent into the newfound El Dorado of the West.
Okay, so one of the worst crimes in history is actually the most magnificent drama. They descended into hell, and in the 3rd century they arose from the dead. So this is the Christian metaphor. So on the 3rd day he arose from the dead. In the 3rd century they arose from the dead. In the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. So that's the Reconstruction era. This is Civil War and Reconstruction. It was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution. Yet we are blind and led by the blind. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. Before the dumb eyes of 10 generations of 10 million children, it is made mockery of and spit upon. A degradation of the eternal mother, a sneer at human effort, with aspiration and art deliberately and elaborately distorted. And why? Because in a day when the human mind aspired to a science of human action, a history and psychology of the mighty effort of the mightiest century, we fell under the leadership of those who would compromise with truth in the past in order to make peace in the present and guide policy in the future. So he's talking about Redeemer history. So this is the history that said that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about the North dominating the South. And of course, Reconstruction was a disaster because it was corrupt. And it was just this kind of circus of chaos and violence. And, therefore was bound to fail. Whereas he's saying no. In fact, it was the greatest effort of the mightiest century, the 19th century. And again, we make peace in the present to guide policy in the future by treating that history as having happened the way it had to have happened. Du Bois is saying, why were black people brought to America through the transatlantic slave trade? To make revolution. To make revolution. That's the meaning of all the historical suffering. Otherwise, that's nothing. Otherwise, it's nothing. Meaning it put black people in a place to contribute to the struggle for freedom.
Like from a Marxist Hegelian point of view, when all history points to revolution, so this is not to say it's not part of slavery, but like all that's happening in capitalism right now is like for Hegelians is leading to the revolution.
Well,
Like
it has to
AI,
be made to.
Infrastructure, 300
Yeah.
years of slavery, fascism, the pandemic. You could choose, you could change slavery in this paragraph for any other phenomenon that has happened in late capitalism, and it would mean the same thing, wouldn't it?
But only if we make it so. In other words, it won't
Yeah.
happen automatically. It won't happen automatically.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that just of course for Du Bois, the most important thing is black reconstruction and slavery and racial politics, but you could, as I'm saying, you could change the slavery subject in this paragraph for AI and say how data has been collected and how infrastructure has been built and how labor has been reified through technology more and more, so that it's all pointing to a very transitional point towards revolution.
Yes. If we make it
like
so.
justification of all the things that I've done. Right?
Yes.
It is like justification.
Well, it can threaten to be. And then we're going to see where we're going with Benjamin is faith in progress. We can't have any faith in progress. I think that we already hit this with the surrealism essay, yes? No faith in progress. No faith in the fate of European humanity. No. Only unlimited faith in E.G. Farben and the peaceful development of the Air Force. Right? So, no faith in progress, but accepting the task of it. The task. It's a task. It's not something to believe in or not believe in. It's something to be taken up as a task. Meaning, what are we going to do with everything that's happened? Everything that's happened has brought us to this point. And what are we going to do now?
So it's more about embracing the responsibility.
Yes. Yes.
And for that we need a Messiah.
No. In fact, remember,
to have repudiated with utmost vehemence. The Messiah is outside of history.
No, yeah, no, sorry.
Yeah, that's
not
no.
but
Benjamin's not messianic
but-
like that. No.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to like understand. It's like no, of course we don't need a Messiah because like the king is on us,
It's
not
on
like
us.
on something else.
Yeah, it's on us.
But like, what does Benjamin then mean by messianic history? Like, who or what is playing the messianic role, if not a person or a god or a being?
Well, couldn't it be a thing like AI or whatever it is?
No, I hope not. That's
I
a
know,
Deus Ex
right? But like
Machina.
something.
No, yeah, it's like the anti-messiah. No?
Yeah, it would be the Antichrist, for sure. I mean, look, the question is the meaning of the messianic. Meaning, the messianic is still with us because the past is still with us, and because we make sense of the present using past tools. And it's built into our language, our philosophy, our metaphysics, everything. It's in art, it's in literature. So we've talked about that. Like you pick up a novel, you're reading the Bible. It's still the same thing. It speaks with the voice of God. Language speaks with the voice of God, even though we know it's the voice of man. So it's not like, because I had this argument with my dissertation advisor. He's like, Chris, he's an African American literature scholar, Kenneth Warren. And he's like, but Chris, Benjamin believes in Adamic language. And I was like, no, that's not the point. Right, the point is, why would we ever have had the idea of Adamic language? Why would we ever have come up with this idea of language before the fall? True language that we can't have now. Where does that come from? What's the meaning of that idea? Because obviously it never existed. Paradise, Adam and Eve, that situation never happened. It never happened. Yet we believe that there's such a thing as pure language. Language that actually means it's identical with its referent. So where does that come from? In the same way that we were never expelled from paradise, the Messiah will never come and end history. That is not going to happen. We're not going to be resurrected in our bodies. I mean, I don't know, maybe we will, but who knows? That will be in another dimension. It won't be within historical time or politics. So the question is, what does it mean? We have to figure out what it means. You know, redemption, again, redemption. What would it mean? So Du Bois is pretty much making a claim in the 1930s. He's making a claim to redeem this history against the Redeemer history. So the Redeemer history is like, the South wasn't so bad. Actually, the slave owners treated the slaves better than the Northern industrialists treat the workers. And maybe that's true. And maybe that's true. Maybe the industrialists just poison the working class with no thought that there isn't even caring enough to actually take out a whip and flog someone. You just cast millions into misery and despair and death. You don't even bother to punish a slave. Right? So the Redeemer history was like, oh, you guys got rid of slavery. How has it worked out? Has it worked out well? No, you've produced this industrial hell. Because the Industrial Revolution came after. And you know what they did after Reconstruction also? They did chain gang labor. They did forced labor. And in some ways, forced labor was worse than slavery. So blacks were free, but they were worked to death as prison labor in a way that they would have been too valuable as slaves to have done that. At the end of the history of slavery, people would not work their slaves to death. After slavery, they did work black people to death, also white people. It was worse than slavery, in fact. And yet, what does that mean? Do you want to restore slavery? No. And even if you were to, you would restore industrial slavery. It wouldn't be like the old slavery. So how do you redeem the history? Right? You can't pretend it didn't happen, nor can you try to go back to it in some way. Nor can you write it. You can't like repair it either. You can't like, so that's why it seems like, oh, it's just like a magic wand. 10 million people dragged across the Atlantic, and that's like a magnificent drama. We have to try to redeem it. Or like Hegel said. Like we just look at the slaughter bench of history and
But
we
why
get...
do you have to redeem it? I don't get it.
Because we have to act in the present on the basis of the past. I mean, we can't start the world
But that's not
anew.
what happened, basically. The same thing kept happening over and over to them. There was no redemption.
In the 60s it looked like there was. It did. It really did.
There has been some, right? But like not really though. Like it was like if you just go for the 100 years after that, it's just this similar.
Right, 100 years after the Civil War sucked. But then it looked like it was going to be redeemed in the 60s, and then since then it's like, oh, actually conditions got worse because of deindustrialization. Rahm Emanuel. Okay, so he was Obama's chief of staff. And he was mayor of Chicago after being Obama's chief. Is he?
What?
I might be making this up, but I believe he actually studied dance here.
That would be too amazing. That'd be too amazing. Let me see about that. Yeah.
If I'm lying, I'm sorry.
So anyway, what I was going to say about Rahm Emanuel is when he was mayor of Chicago, he had an off-the-record conversation in which he said, why are we wasting all this money educating these black kids who will never have a job? That's Obama's chief of staff. Why are we wasting all this money educating black kids who will never have a job? Of course it's true. Of course it's true. So that's pretty bleak. I'm not sure that anyone in the 1950s, at the end of segregation, thought that educating black kids in separate schools was a total waste of money. No, they didn't. Like the crackers in the South who upheld segregation, they didn't think it was a waste of money to educate black kids because there were jobs. There were jobs. Now there are no jobs. It's worse. But that's capitalism.
Well, isn't it worse like that there are jobs, but they are bullshit jobs? Like the Raber book, how you
Yeah.
like people can access jobs, but they are like on fast food services or.
Even that's better than no job.
Yeah, of course, because labor creates local reality in capitalism. Right?
Whereas, like, one of my coworkers, when I worked at Kinko's, when I first lived in Chicago when I was 23, I guess I was 24 when I started working at Kinko's. No, I was 23. I had a temp job before that. That was a little bit better, but then I decided to take a regular job just for the stability of it. And I worked with almost all black coworkers, and it was in Lincoln Park. It was very strange, and the manager was black also. And some of them were like artists like me. Like there was like musicians, there was an actor, but then there were people who just were straight out of the ghetto and commuted from other parts of the city. And there was one kid who said, so he grew up in the projects in Cabrini Green, and he said, having a job made you white.
Made you white.
Yes, having a job made you white. It's bleak. That was not true in the 1950s or 60s. That's true in the post-industrial era. Having a job makes you white. For the poor.
Crack didn't help either.
No, it did not. Whether brought by the CIA or otherwise.
No.
I'm completely lying. He was into ballet and did win a scholarship to the Joffrey, but ended up going to ceremonies. But I made it up. But he doesn't.
Where did he grow up here?
I believe.
That's weird though. What
Yeah.
a
Oh,
weird.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
like a
All right,
totally
so
random
He
connection.
was in ballet.
So he
Yeah.
was born here, but he wanted to go to school.
I made up the essays connection.
Yeah. So he wanted
He just
to.
wanted to come here.
Maybe.
Oh, Wilmette. Wilmette, that's the North Shore. Yeah, that's nice. Oh, New Trier. Okay.
Actually, I'm at day school.
Evanston School of Ballet. Joffrey Ballet is not here, though, is it?
Mm-hmm.
It is here.
Yeah.
Oh, it is here.
Nutcracker.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So Joffrey Ballet. So that must have been way to think of, right? I was like, does the art institute even have a dance?
I'm abusing history.
Yeah, I don't know if the art
Making
institute
shit
ever
up.
did have a dance department.
So can I ask another question
Go
about
for it.
Messianic history?
Uh-huh.
Because I still don't get it, but how I'm starting to see it is, it's just another way of understanding history in which we are all collectively Messianic because we can understand the relation between present and past to become something different in the future. So we all, it's not like we're expecting. So has history always been Messianic, or is it like a modern thing?
No, it's always been Messianic because, after all, the ancients came up with the idea. Although they placed it outside of history. So here's the Kant that I mentioned earlier, the universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view. This is what the glittering misery reference is from.
So for Benjamin, all history is Messianic?
Potentially, but let's look at this. Okay. Nature has willed that man should by himself produce everything that goes beyond the mechanical ordering of his animal existence, and that he should partake of no other happiness or perfection than that which he himself, independently of instinct, is thus created by his own reason. Nature does nothing in vain, etc., etc. He alone, man should alone have the credit and should have only himself to thank, exactly as if she aimed more at his rational self-esteem than his well-being. For along this march of human affairs, there was a host of troubles awaiting him, but it seems not to have concerned nature that he should live well, but only that he should work himself upward so as to make himself, through his own actions, worthy of life and well-being. It remains strange that the earlier generations appear to carry through their toilsome labor only for the sake of the later, to prepare for them a foundation on which the later generations could erect the higher edifice which was nature's goal. And yet that only the latest of the generations should have the good fortune to inhabit the building on which a long line of their ancestors had unintentionally labored, without being permitted to partake of the fortune they had prepared. However puzzling this may be, it is necessary if one assumes that a species of animals should have reason, and as a class of rational beings, each of whom dies while the species is immortal, should develop their capacities to perfection. Right, so we are living in the results of the toil of the past. We do redeem the past. We're redeeming it all the time. The question is, how are we redeeming it? We are redeeming it, but as Benjamin put it in Experience in Poverty, we might be redeeming it for a fraction of its true value. In capitalism, we might be wasting the value of the past. We might be squandering it. So in this sense, we do redeem the past. The question is how? And how well or badly? Right, to use the Nietzsche language. We might be aware of the fact that we are redeeming it for a fraction of its value, that we're redeeming it badly, that we're wasting all of the suffering the past produced. In other words, use the example. Hundreds of years of slavery. as also the genocide of Native Americans. So I think that I had like some public speaking engagement where I said the U.S. is not the product of slavery and genocide. No. It's the product of labor, including the labor of those who were enslaved and genocided. Meaning we have to make good at the sacrifice. Otherwise it was for nothing. We have to get something out of all this. And that something would be something other than capitalism, which might be worse, but at least it'll be different. And at least we won't be bored or melancholic.
We won't be.
The revolution won't be boring or melancholic.
Oh.
Maybe we'll be bored and melancholic after the revolution, but not in the revolution. We might be manic in the revolution. Right? That's a cure for boredom and melancholia, though. It's a dangerous one, but it is something of one. I mean, look, Nietzsche is a melancholic for sure, and he's a maniac for sure. But again, maybe we all are.
But he's closer to the maniac side, feels like.
Aren't we all though? What about the fact that all people with successful careers have to take cocaine?
What was the question? That you said that before that.
Why do all people with successful careers have to take
But
cocaine?
before that,
No, I said that
Thank you,
he's
brother.
closer
He's
to the
more
maniac.
manic than
Oh.
melancholic. No, he's pretty clearly melancholic. He's compensating. Yeah.
How would it look this?
More fati. You know, love your fate. Like, who has to tell themselves that? Only a melancholic.
Because just the way he talks about joy, energy, like, it feels more of this maniac stage. Yeah.
Well, he hopes for it, but let's look at the end of it. So the end of it is when he's very clear that it's not him. It's for those who will come after him. It's the younger people. It's the future generations, right? Let's see. Oh, the new faith. Okay, let's see. So he's saying, oh, this is the anti-Martin one. Okay. Thinking of youth at this point, I cry, land ho, land ho. Enough and more than enough of this passionately searching and erring voyage on dark alien seas. Now a coastline is finally in sight. Whatever it may be like, we must land there. And the worst harbor of refuge is better than once again to stagger back into hopeless, skeptical infinity. Right? Let us hold fast to land now. Later, we shall no doubt find the good harbors and make the approach of those who follow easier. Dangerous and exciting was this voyage. How far are we now from the quiet contemplation with which we first saw our ship float out to sea? In tracking down the dangers of history, we have found ourselves most severely exposed to them. We ourselves display the traces of those sufferings which, as a consequence of an excess of history, came over men of recent times. And precisely this treatise, as I will not conceal, shows its modern character, the character of weak personality, in the excess of criticism, in the immaturity of its humanity, in the frequent transition from irony to cynicism, from pride to skepticism. And yet I trust in the inspiring power which instead of a genius guides my vehicle. I trust in youth to have guided me correctly, when now it forces me to protest against the historical education of modern youth. And when in protest I demand that above all men must learn to live and use history only in the service of life they have learned to live. One has to be young to understand this protest, and considering the early gray hair of our present youth, one can hardly be young enough still to feel against what is really being protested here. An example will be helpful. Let me jump here. This is the poetry section. Okay. Plato, we can leave because Plato wanted to take children away from their parents. So Plato would have established the Campuchia, the Khmer Rouge. That's definitely very Platonic. No, let's leave that aside. Okay, do not be surprised they bear the names of poisons. The antidotes to the historical are called the unhistorical and the superhistorical. With these names, we return to the beginnings of our essay to their calm. By the word the unhistorical, I denote the art and strength of being able to forget and enclose oneself in a limited horizon. Superhistorical, I call the powers which guide the eye away from becoming and towards that which gives existence an eternal and stable character, towards art and religion. This is the early Nietzsche, who's very anti-science. Science, for it is science which would speak of poisons, sees in that force and these powers hostile powers and forces. For it only takes the observation of things to be the true and correct one. That is to be scientific observation, whereas which everywhere sees what has come to be, the historical, and no word being, the eternal. It lives in inner contradiction with the eternalizing powers of art and religion, so far as it hates forgetting, the death of knowledge, so far as it seeks to remove all horizon limitations and throws man into an endless, unlimited light wave sea of known becoming. If only he could live therein. As in an earthquake, cities collapse and become deserted, and man erects his house on volcanic ground, only hastily and trembling with fear. So life itself collapses into itself and becomes feeble and discouraged when the concept quake, which science provokes, takes from man the foundation of his security and calm, the belief in the enduring and eternal. Now is life to rule over knowledge, over science, or is knowledge to rule over life? Covered that already. And here I recognize the mission of that youth, that first generation of fighters and serpent slayers, which precedes a happier and more beautiful culture and humanity, without having more than an inkling full of promise of this future happiness and beauty to come. This youth will suffer from the malady and the antidote at the same time. And nevertheless, they believe to be entitled to boast of stronger health and in general of a more natural nature than their forebears, the educated men and old men of the present. But it is their mission to shake the concepts which that present has of health and education, and to generate ridicule and hatred against such hybrid concept monsters. And the hallmark of their robust health is to be just this, that they, namely this youth, can themselves use no concept, no party slogans from the present store of current word and concept coinage to designate their own essence, but are only convinced at every appropriate moment by a power active in them, of fighting, eliminating, and separating power, and by an ever-heightened sense of life. One may deny that this youth already possesses culture, but for what youth would that be a reproach? One may speak of their lack of refinement and moderation, but they are not yet old and wise enough to know their place. But above all, they need not feign and defend a ready-made culture, and they enjoy all the consolations and privileges of youth, especially the privilege of courageous, heedless honesty and the inspiring consolation of hope. I know that these hopeful ones intimately understand all these generalities, and that with their very own experience they will translate them for themselves into a doctrine meant personally. The others may meanwhile perceive nothing but covered bowls, which may well be empty, until one day, to their surprise, they see with their own eyes that the bowls are full, and that attacks, demands, drives to life, passions lay boxed up and pressed together in these generalities, which could not remain covered long. By the way,
Benjamin's going to talk about empty homogeneous time and full homogeneous time. Referring these doubters to time, which brings everything to light, I turn in conclusion to that company of hopeful ones to tell them in a parable the course and progress of their own cure, their rescue from the historical malady, and so their own history to the point in time at which they will again be well enough to engage in studying history anew and to use history under the dominion of life in that threefold sense, namely monumental, antiquarian, and critical. At that point in time, they will be more ignorant than the educated of the present, for they will have unlearned much and moreover will have lost all inclination even to look at what those educated ones want to know above all. Their distinguishing characteristics seen from the perspective of those educated ones are precisely their lack of education, their indifference and reserve towards much that is famous, even towards much that is good. But at that final point in their cure, they have become human again and have ceased to be humanoid aggregates, that is something. Those are still hopes. Do not your hearts leap for joy at the thought, you hopeful ones. And how do we arrive at that goal, you will ask? Already at the beginning of a journey to that goal, the Delphic god calls his motto to you, know thyself. It is a hard motto, for that god does not conceal and does not reveal, but only indicates, as Heraclitus has said. What does he point out to you? There have been centuries in which the Greeks found themselves in a danger similar to the one in which we find ourselves, namely of being swamped by what is alien and past, of perishing through history. Never have they lived proudly untouchable. For a long time their culture was rather a chaos of foreign, Semitic, Babylonian, Lydian, and Egyptian forms and concepts, and their religion a veritable battle of gods of the whole Orient. Similarly, perhaps, as German culture and religion is now an internally battling chaos of all foreign countries of all antiquity. And nevertheless, Hellenic culture became no aggregate, thanks to that Apollonian motto. The Greeks learned gradually to organize chaos by reflecting on themselves in accordance with the Delphic teaching, that is, by reflecting on their genuine needs and letting their sham needs die out. Thus they took possession of themselves again. They did not long remain the overloaded heirs and epigoni of the whole Orient. After a difficult struggle with themselves and through the practical interpretation of that motto, they even became the happiest enrichers and increasers of the inherited treasure and the first comers and models of all coming cultured peoples. This is a parable for each one of us. He must organize the chaos within himself by reflecting on his genuine needs. His honesty, his sound and truthful character must at some time rebel against secondhand thought, secondhand learning and imitation. Then he will begin to comprehend that culture can be something other still than decoration of life. That is, fundamentally always only dissimulation and disguise, for all adornment hides what it adorns. Thus the Greek concept of culture, in contrast to the Romance concept, will be unveiled to me. The concept of a culture that is new and improved nature, that's physis, by the way, without inside and outside, without dissimulation and convention, of culture as the accord of life, thought, appearing, and willing. Thus he will learn from his own experience that it was the entire strength of ethical nature that the Greeks achieved a victory over all other cultures, and that every increase in truthfulness must also be a preparatory advancement of true culture. Even if this truthfulness may on occasion seriously harm the notion of culture which just then enjoys respect, even if it occasions the fall of an entire decorative culture. Okay, so again, what did the Greeks do? They inherited and synthesized and made new what was old by reckoning with their own true needs. So again, the kind of critical moment. We're going to see Benjamin recapitulate this in the concept of history. He's going to have his own notion of critique, a historical critique. So for Nietzsche, it's the present that judges the past. We skipped over that section where he says people who are doing history critically are dangerous and in danger.
right? Because they're judging based on their needs. They're not judging according to rightfulness or mercy, and that they're producing a second nature that might be weaker than their first nature by overthrowing the past. So with Nietzsche, it's the present that judges the past. With Benjamin, we'll see it's going to be the past that judges the present. And why is that? Because we're overdue. The Arcades Project is about that 1848 aftermath moment and how the 20th century is a repetition. So we're overdue, meaning people in the 19th century already knew what the task was. Nietzsche knew in his own way, Marx knew in his own way, Baudelaire knew. So the past judges the present. All right. We didn't get to the conversations with Brecht, so we'll do that next time.
And Convolute, yeah?
Hmm?
And Convolute.
Convolute, we did not do Convolute yet, or Boredom and Eternal Return. We talked about Eternal Return a little bit. But boredom, so the idea that art might be something to entertain us in our boredom, you know, we read that in Baudelaire. Also that boredom might be a symptom of modernity. At least in the sense that we might be bored for different reasons than people in the past were bored.
Were they bored?
They may not have been bored the way we were bored. They may not have been. Yeah, they may not have been. So there are all sorts of things to modernity that we might take for granted but falsely naturalize. Like boredom, melancholy, of course. The pleasure that we get from activities that annihilate time, like gambling.
Video games.
Video games for sure, yeah, video games. Right, what art and literature and experience became in modernity might be different than in the past. Yeah. But again, not just bad, not just like, oh, this sucks, but rather what does it mean? I mean, that's really the issue. Just to come back to the redemption and the Messiah bit. So, politics is driven by theological, still is driven by theological stuff. The question is, what does it mean? What does it tell us? Not like we should do something other than that. Like maybe we have to.
We cannot do otherwise.
Right. And so I guess that's the other thing about the Messianic, is that, you know, what people do is that they read Benjamin dialectically. So they read the Messianic as not self-contradictory, but it has to be. In other words, we don't have a demand for redemption or messianism the way ancient peoples did. It's not the same. Right, so, which means that if you try to look at it as a just an inheritance of the old theology, you find that it contradicts itself. We're trying to bring about the end of the world. Why? Right? Because the end of the world is not something that we can bring about according to religion. Right? It will just happen. Right, so I think that that's the other point, is like, yeah, Benjamin's, yeah, I mean, there's something also, not messianic about Nietzsche. It's not messianic. Right, so, if anything, it's very anti-messianic. He's very anti-religion, as you guys know. Nietzsche, right? The death of God, etc.
Yeah, it's obvious even in this piece, and how he discusses Christianity.
Mm-hmm. You'll notice that when he attacks Hegelianism in this piece, it's the Christian Hegelianism, it's the right Hegelianism. Right, it's the kind of the people who are kind of rationalizing or apologizing, which he takes to be built into Hegel. All right, so yeah, so we have some more to do next time besides what I laid out, but we all have time. There's a lot of material to go through with the Paris exposés, because there are like a lot of little pieces to it. But we'll start with the conversation with Brecht. All right, thanks guys. See you next week. Take care, guys. See you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you. All right. See you.
Bye. See you.
Oops.